Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to be joined by editor of Spiked and host of the Brendan O'Neill Show. It's Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Lots to talk about. Never a dull moment in the world of identity politics and freedom of expression. Before we jump into all the big issues, maybe you could just let my viewers know and listeners, how would you describe what you do? What keeps you busy?
Well, I'm the editor of Spiked, and Spiked is a radical humanist magazine. We're pro-democracy, pro-freedom, particularly pro-freedom of speech. We're in favour of the Enlightenment. We describe ourselves as coming from the left, but that seems to confuse a lot of people these days. It's a daily magazine. We publish 6 or 7 articles every day. We also publish podcasts and videos. So being the editor of that keeps me pretty busy. I also write for various other publications, and I do, bits of media work. But generally, I spend most of my time pushing what I consider to be important arguments into the world and hoping that people will take notice and respond in a nice way.
Yeah, so I frequently share Spiked articles. I've connected with a lot of your writers there, and I get a mixed response. Now, there are some people who are absolutely convinced it's a far-right publication. Others tell me it's some sort of, a Trojan communist neo-Marxist outlet. Others tell me it's the Koch brothers' pet project, and I'm just wondering what kind of invites this sort of criticism where we've got complete polar opposites being levelled at that publication as accusations.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good sign. I mean, it's all quite annoying. If you're insulted all the time, it's quite annoying. It gets a bit tiresome. There's willful misrepresentation of what Spike says and willful misrepresentation of Spike writers, and all that kind of stuff is irritating, but also par for the course in a political climate in which there is unfortunately a lot of tribalism and hatefulness and toxicity. So it's all to be expected, and I don't mind it that much. But I think in response to the question is why there are so many different views or interpretations of what Spike does, I think people find it hard to pigeonhole us. So, for example, one day we might publish a piece arguing in defense of the right to strike. We're very much in favour of working people having the right to strike. We think it's actually one of the most important rights. The right to withdraw your labour is one of the most useful tools that many people have. And so people will call us commies and Marxists and everything else. And then another day we will write in favour of freedom of speech for fascists, or freedom of speech for alt-right people, or people on the dodgy right wing of politics. And if you defend freedom of speech for those kinds of people, there are some commentators who mistakenly think you must support those people's view. There is this, one of the most stupid ideas today, I think, is the notion that if you defend someone's freedom of speech, you must be doing it because you like that person and what that person has to say. So I would say we have a pretty principled approach to core issues, particularly freedom of speech and democracy. And the idea that makes one far right, I think, is completely hysterical, completely historically illiterate. The far right has never been interested in freedom, certainly not freedom of speech. It's never been interested in democracy. So that's the accusation I find most strange. Spike writers devote themselves to pushing what I would consider to be pretty progressive causes in the old-fashioned sense of that word. And yet there are some people out there who call us far right. I think it indicates that they don't understand us and they don't understand history.
It's really interesting how the topic of freedom of expression will often set off that landmine, because I consider myself a liberal lefty. However, I have the accusation of far right or right wing thrown at me all the time, and it always seems to relate to a position I've took on principle regarding freedom of expression and nominally terrible people. And I think that became really clear to me round about the time Richard Spencer got punched on the streets of Washington in the States, and the glee by which people celebrated that and tried to endorse it. And I'm no fan of Richard Spencer. I polar opposite ideology in every way, but surely there has to be a line between violence and criticism when you hear words that you don't agree with. So how have we got to the point now where it seems almost fashionable now as long as you've got a bad guy in your sights, as long as you have managed to finger the bigger, as it were, anything seems to be justified now. And this is coming from often well-educated people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think identity politics, which I think is the scourge of the modern era, I think it's now spinning out of control. And I think it's actually becoming quite violent. And I think when I look back over the past 5 to 10 years, particularly what's been happening on campuses and which has spread more and more into political life, social life, cultural life, all those ideas that you should judge people by their identity, that someone's identity is the most important thing about them. You should never offend people. You should watch your words. You should police your language. You should agree to use the right pronouns and agree to use the right politically correct speech. And if you don't, you can be expelled from polite society. All those ideas that have been gathering pace for quite a long time have spread from universities, where really they originate in large part, into the political sphere and the sphere of entertainment and the sphere of culture, the sphere of comedy. There are so many spheres of life now that are infected by this notion of, I guess you could call it wokeness, for want of a better word, or political correctness, but certainly a censorious attitude, which says that people's self-esteem, particularly their identitarian self-esteem, is more important than your freedom of speech. So if a Muslim were to take offence at someone drawing a picture of Muhammad, that should take precedence over your right to draw a picture of Muhammad. If a trans person takes offence at your refusal to use certain pronouns or to use the word woman spelt with an X, that takes precedence over your unwillingness to use pronouns or your unwillingness to use the woman word when it's spelt with an X. So those ideas have been going around for a long time, and they've moved into the real world, the world outside of the university. And I think as that has happened, they've become more intense, they've become more unstable, and they are increasingly becoming quite violent. And I think some of the stuff we're seeing in the United States at the moment, I think is probably a glimpse of what could well happen in the UK and other countries in the not too distant future. Because when you see groups of people under the banner of Black Lives Matter screaming at people who are just eating at a restaurant, or when you see statues being toppled and beheaded and rolled into rivers, and when you see this general intolerance and even shootings of people. There was a shooting, there have been numerous shootings in the US in recent weeks, but there was a shooting of a man from a hard right group called Patriot Prayer. And what was most shocking about that was the response to it. You had people online, on Twitter, even, semi-respectable people in the sphere of commentary who were essentially saying, oh, well, it's Patriot Prayer, they're a bunch of scumbags, they're essentially Nazis, so don't worry about it, it's fine. And so what's happening is that intolerance has become increasingly militant. And I think a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is the armed wing of political correctness. And when you think back, it's actually a short step from saying you can be sacked for having the wrong opinion, you can be no platformed from campus for having the wrong opinion, you can be shunned from polite society for having the wrong opinion. It's a short step from that to the notion that you could potentially be physically punished for having the wrong opinion. You might get beaten up on the streets, or like Peter Hitchens, you might get hounded out of the centre of Oxford by a group of people jeering at you, which happened recently to Peter Hitchens. We're witnessing I think the violence of political correctness. That's now what's happening. And I think that's why it's incredibly important to get control of this issue, to restate the case for complete freedom of speech and tolerance in order to keep at bay these new mobs, these kind of Maoist mobs, who I think are quite dangerous to civil society and liberty.
Yeah, so in terms of complete freedom of expression, I tend to err on the side of free speech absolutism, which is what I tend to advocate for. But obviously there has to be perhaps a line, or maybe hypothetically there may be a line, and it's difficult to know where that is depending on the situation. And just to play devil's advocate, really, are there any areas where you think speech can go too far and may warrant a legal intervention? I mean, we already have libel laws in this country. I mean, it might be be a good idea to have a legal right to have recourse against defamation and lies put about you in print that are damaging to your reputation. It might be a case of saying, well, that doesn't really count as free expression if you're defaming somebody. But what about things such as incitement to violence and things like that?
The only line I have is the line that the American Civil Liberties Union used to have when it was a pretty good civil libertarian organisation. It's kind of lost its way in recent years. But the only line they had was the line that speech should only be punishable if it could give rise to imminent violence. And I think the word imminent there is very important because in recent years in the UK as well, we've seen things being banned on the basis that they could cause violence, but it's not imminent violence at all. There's no logic to this idea. So, for example, there were various efforts by Peter Tatchell and others. I happen to admire Peter Tatchell, but I think he's got a weak spot on freedom of speech. But there was various efforts by him and others to ban Jamaican dancehall music, some of which is very homophobic and some of which is even violently homophobic. And I think Brighton Council did ban Jamaican dancehall music in its local clubs for a period of time. And the argument was that this music, because it says things like, kill gays, string them up, all those kinds of, pretty vile sentiments, the notion was that it could incite violence. I just think that's a fantasy. I think if you're in a club at midnight and you're dancing to these songs and then the next day you go out and kill a gay guy, that's not the fault of the Jamaican dancehall singer. There's a long period of time between your hearing that song and your exercise of your free will to commit a violent act. We've also seen this idea that criticizing transgenderism is like an act of violence. It could cause people to commit suicide, this kind of emotional blackmail that is used against feminists in particular, who are constantly told that if they criticize transgenderism, they are endangering young trans people's lives. And again and again, the argument that used to hold on the right, particularly the Christian conservative right, the notion that there are some films and books and pieces of art that are so grotesque or dangerous or sexual that they could cause people to commit terrible acts. That used to be an idea that was more pronounced in the conservative right and the Christian right. That's now shifted over to become the property of supposed liberals and even radical left-wingers, who will now frequently argue that there are some forms of culture that are just too dangerous to be allowed. If you cast your mind back to the discussion about lads mags a few years ago, there was a moral panic, I would say, about lads mags and this idea that these magazines with semi-nudity and kind of tongue-in-cheek masculine columns and, pretty stupid stuff. The notion that this would give rise to a rape culture and that it was contributing to a rape culture which endangered women's lives. Those arguments are now pushed by some feminists, by some leftists, even by some radicals, in the same way that they were traditionally pushed by people like Mary Whitehouse and others who worried that if people saw a blasphemous film, they would lose faith in God, or if people saw a violent a video nasty, as they used to be called, they might go out and commit an act of violence. So I think, in my view, there's no line that is justifiable except the possibility that your words will cause an imminent act of violence. So if I'm sitting with you and I say, go over and kill that person, that's a justifiable form of speech that could be, I think, justifiably punished. Everything else, and I would include defamation and libel, which I would prefer were dealt with in the arena of public open debate rather than in the libel courts. I think everything else has to be fair game as much as possible in order that we can defend the highest form of freedom.
Sure. I just love this image of the homophobic murderer waiting in the wings for the green light from the Jamaican dancehall singer.
Crazy.
Yeah. But I mean, this idea of incitement, in a sense, it does kind of generalize the public as mere idiots waiting for the instruction to attack, doesn't it? It kind of removes personal agency in that sense. And it's interesting to see a lot of this coming from my own camp, which is the left. And I often wonder, why do we have such a blind spot when it comes from the left in terms of what now appears to be a rise of far left extremism in many senses. Because if this was coming from a certain type of person on the right, we would have identified it long ago and eradicated it from our institutions and our media outlets, and it would have got a very stern talking to in civil society in general. But whereas when it comes from the left, it seems to be gaining more and more traction in mainstream circles.
Yeah, I think there has been a palpable shift of the censorship argument from the right to the left, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the key, the idea that always underpins censorship is that the public cannot be trusted. That is the heart and soul and lungs of the ideology of censorship. The notion that you have to censor this thing because it will drive people crazy. I mean, I can't think of any act of censorship in history that didn't have that idea at the root of it. You think about the Vatican used to have a list of banned books, books of heresy or books that would drive people crazy or make them believe things they shouldn't believe or turn them into devil worshippers. The notion was that these books would pollute mankind's soul and therefore they had to be hidden away. Fast forward to today, and those kinds of arguments are made primarily, sadly, by people on the left. They will now be the ones who argue that there are some forms of literature or some public speakers who come to campus or certain forms of criticism of Islam or certain forms of trans skepticism, which are just too lethal and toxic and polluting to have free expression. And the underlying idea all the time is that the stupid, gullible, feckless, impressionable public will be led astray by this stuff, and therefore it has to be hidden away in some fashion. It has to be taken off Twitter, it has to be removed from the campuses, and it has to be banned. If you look at what some on the left say about tabloid newspapers, for example, Extinction Rebellion recently blockaded the production and delivery of certain newspapers, not just tabloids, but also the Times and the Telegraph. And one of the leaflets that Extinction Rebellion put out said something like, the problem with these newspapers is that they fill people's heads with lies. They don't tell the truth. They encourage people not to take climate change seriously. So there's this constant notion that there is this gullible mass of people with putty-like brains who are just putty in the hands of billionaires and oligarchs and demagogues who can just mold us to think anything that they want us to. It's a deeply elitist idea, and it is the idea that always fuels censorship. The worrying thing for me is how this idea has become, if anything, more pronounced on the left than it is on the right or in religious circles. It's now the left that pushes this, which I think is incredibly sad. The left in the 20th century was often at the forefront of arguing for freedom of speech. The Western left, the Stalinist left in the east of the world, it was a different matter. But the left in the West was often at the forefront of arguing for the right of countercultural experimentation, the right to make rude films, the right to make horror films, the right to display certain forms of art, the right to publish all sorts of books, from Lady Chatterley's Lover through to, the blasphemous poem that was published in the late 1970s in Gay News, which featured a Roman centurion doing something sexual to Jesus Christ. That was one of the last, I think it was the last charge of blasphemy that was brought in this country. In all those cases, it was very often left-wingers who said, listen, chill out, relax, freedom of speech is incredibly important, and ordinary people are more than capable of coping with this kind of content. They've abandoned that argument and become the kind of stiff censors that they might once have criticised. And I think that's incredibly sad. And anything that can be done to convince the left that freedom of speech is an important value for everyone, especially those with edgy, outsider style ideas, anything that can be done to make them remember that, I think is important to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting that when you look back at the era of Thatcher, for instance, and video nasties and films that were considered beyond the pale and banning and editing, really heavy editing of certain movies, that seems to be back in vogue. But for transgressing the woke ideology. We've seen a lot of the major streaming platforms remove certain scenes of, I think blackface has been one of them. I think the new Disney streaming services removed quote unquote problematic scenes from some of their back catalogue. So I was just wondering how you feel about this idea of retroactively editing established art to fit with the current zeitgeist. And I mean, how much sense does that make to you?
No sense at all. I think it is profoundly Orwellian. There's been a real outburst of it over the past few weeks in relation to the Black Lives Matter stuff, or rather, Black Lives Matter has been the justification for this kind of stuff. There's been loads of retrospective editing and censorship. We've seen British comedy shows being memory holed by Netflix and the BBC because they had instances of blackface. There was that discussion about the Fawlty Towers episode in which Basil Fawlty makes fun of a German, and in which the Major uses the N-word. I think that's the key problem in that episode, even though to anyone with an ounce of common sense, which I would say is most people, it's very clear that the people being sent up in that episode of Fawlty Towers are the racist people, are the people who are saying either anti-German things or anti-black things. They're the ones we're laughing at. The idea that people might watch that and say, oh, it's acceptable to use the N-word or it's acceptable to make fun of German people is a complete and utter fantasy. So I think that kind of retrospective censorship is really worrying, because it really points to a year zero mentality. This notion right now that exists, especially in radical circles, unfortunately, that, we're at year zero, we are morally perfect, apparently, even though I would say that's not true. We're morally perfect. Everything that came before us is morally suspect or morally compromised or had dodgy links with dodgy ideas and dodgy practices, and therefore we have to cleanse the public realm of any evidence that it ever existed. So comedy shows and other things have been shoved down the memory hole, as George Orwell called it. We've seen statues being torn down, of course. Now we have this institutions in the UK are in the grip of a kind of self-loathing hysteria, this orgy of self-loathing at the British Library, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, all of which are tearing their hair out over their exhibits and their history and the question of who founded them and whether their founders had any links to slavery. They're taking down busts of their owners. The Natural History Museum is apparently rethinking or is on the way to rethinking some of its exhibits, how it presents Charles Darwin.
Yeah, Darwin's cancelled.
Unbelievable. And, I was thinking, when they come for Darwin, we're in big, big trouble, because Darwin is arguably, one of the most important thinkers in human history. I mean, he's up there with anyone else you could name in terms of revolutionizing how we understand ourselves and how we understand the world, the natural world. I mean, his contribution to human understanding is immeasurable. And when someone like that is being called into question because he went on a colonizing ship as part of his entirely legitimate and revolutionary scientific studies, I just think we're in deep trouble. And what it actually points to is that this is more than just an outburst of censorship. This is more than just a post-George Floyd meltdown. I mean, it never made sense to me that all of this stuff was a response to the gruesome murder of George Floyd. That makes no sense. What we're actually witnessing, I think the events of the past few months and the George Floyd killing are best seen as a catalyst for something that already existed, which is this deep sense of self-loathing and self-doubt within Western institutions themselves, and this turn against the Enlightenment, and this notion among some of the most important institutions in the West. I mean, the British Museum in my mind is the greatest museum in the world. It's the museum that most wonderfully tells the human story. As an institute of the Enlightenment, it is almost perfect in what it presents to visitors. And even the British Museum is now beating itself over the back about its founder and various other exhibits. And there's no doubt in my mind that at some point it will start sending stuff back to the countries from which it was taken. This is a crisis of enlightenment. That's what we're witnessing. And there's a crisis of freedom of speech, there's a crisis of open debate, and all those things, which are incredibly important to challenge. But more broadly, this is a crisis of enlightenment. And that's why I think it's so important to tackle the root of this and to really start defending those Enlightenment values.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what you say about the killing of George Floyd being the catalyst for a lot of what we've seen over the last few months or so. And to my mind, I don't recall anyone not condemning that in the most absolute, unequivocal terms imaginable from left and right. It seems to be one of the things that seemed to unite both ends of the political spectrum. Everyone seemed to notice and understand that that was an atrocious injustice. However, a lot of the big corporations, a lot of the sporting events in the UK were very quick to sign up to endorse Black Lives Matter, the organisation. And obviously that really needs separating from the phrase, I think, personally. And it seems now that they're slowly catching on to the fact that Black Lives Matter are actually an overt far-left organisation with some very nefarious goals that are external from the goal of fighting, race inequality or attacking police brutality, for instance. And I just wondered why did it take so long for some of our largest institutions to realise that all isn't what it seems with a group like Black Lives Matter?
I think they really got sucked into that moment. And I think in the future, when we've got a bit of space between that moment and our ability to think about it, I think we will realise that it was a very strange, conformist, bizarre moment in political life. Because what happened is there was this grotesque killing. I think you're absolutely right. Everyone I know condemns it in the strongest terms possible. But what you had was people being put under pressure to take the knee, to bow down, to raise their fist on command, as we saw in Washington, D.C., people being told to raise their fist. You remember Dominic Raab said he wouldn't necessarily take the knee because he thinks it's an image of subjugation, and it's about giving in to a political idea rather than doing something actually quite useful for race relations or for improving the condition of certain groups in society. And he got an enormous amount of flack. People were essentially saying to him, how dare you refuse to bow down or kneel down to our ideology and to our movement. So it was a bizarrely conformist moment. It was almost hysterical, and I was really struck by the speed with which Black Lives Matter spread throughout the world, particularly the Western world. And I was thinking recently that it's funny because Black Lives Matter is almost American capitalism's most successful export of recent years.
That's true.
Because as a cultural phenomenon, it has been just staggering. It colonized the world. It was spread through social media. It was spread by the celebrity elites and by massive, massive corporations who have a big amount of influence in people's lives. It was spread by powerful politicians. And what was really striking was that so many local campaigns got completely swept up by the Black Lives Matter juggernaut. So we had people in the UK started to justify their decolonization campaigns on campus, which I think are really worrying campaigns. They started to pursue those under the banner of Black Lives Matter. In Australia, the campaigns for Aboriginal rights, which I think are actually important campaigns, they also started to be pushed under the banner of Black Lives Matter. Across the world, if you wanted any kind of impact on public life or public discussion, you basically had to adopt this American-invented, American-promoted corporate slogan. So it was extraordinary. The pressure to conform was extraordinary. And I was speaking to a nephew of mine who of course put a black square on Instagram on Blackout Day when everyone was putting a black square instead of a photograph to indicate their support for Black Lives Matter. And he was telling me that, him and his friends were messaging each other, and one of them said, why haven't you done it yet? That's really weird. You should do this. And I'm sure there's been a lot of that. I'm sure people feel a lot of pressure to signal the right kind of virtue, to present the right kind of image, and basically to take the knee. Now, my problem is that I think you're right. We've got to make a complete, clear distinction between the sentence Black Lives Matter, which I can't think of a single person who would disagree with that sentence, that Black Lives Matter as much as any other kind of life. Maybe I have a narrow experience of life, but I've never met anyone who doesn't agree with that. But then Black Lives Matter, the movement, Black Lives Matter, the ideology, is something completely different. It has bizarre ideas. It wants to call into question the nuclear family, which is especially bizarre because one of the problems that does face certain minority groups is the decay of family life, or the corrosion of family life, and that causes lots of problems, I think. It's against the nuclear family. It has strange ideas on transgenderism, which are probably not accepted by most of the public. And most importantly, it is very divisive. This is very different to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, which, as Martin Luther King said, was about judging people by the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, which was the great progressive ideal of the past few decades. And all liberals and leftists thought that that was an ideal worth promoting and worth celebrating. What we have now is an identitarian movement, of which Black Lives Matter is a key part, which almost takes the opposite view, which now encourages us to think racially all the time, which wants me to think of myself all the time as a white man. That's all I am. I'm just a white man. I have to constantly be careful about how I relate to black people because we are so immeasurably different. I'm full of privilege, apparently. They're full of suffering. And it actually cajoles us into thinking about people as racial creatures rather than as individual human beings. And I think that's actually the most unforgivable thing about identity politics, the way it has reversed all the amazing gains that have been made in race relations since the 1950s onwards. It's turned all of those on their head. And it now says to people, especially to a younger generation, it says to them, listen, race is the most important thing. Racism is everywhere. Watch your words. Be careful when you're speaking to a black person. Do all these things we tell you to do, or else we will brand you a racist. And that's such a poisonous, divisive message.
Yeah, I think there's something really dangerous and uncomfortable in the idea of people who otherwise would never have considered their skin colour are having to think about it constantly now because of the messages they're being fed. And I can't help but think, and I hope I'm wrong, and I'll be there to oppose it if it does happen, that we're going to see a revival of white nationalism in response. These extreme ideologies seem to feed off each other. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you can't, obviously, the idea of right-wing, might as well say right-wing, actually, right-wing extremism or white nationalism, that seems to get picked up a lot, and that actually gets often found in places it's not as well. We seem to be really sensitive to that. We seem to be really over-tuned into it to the point that it doesn't get a look in anywhere of influence, to my mind. Do you envision a time when that might change in response to some of these far-left ideologies?
Yeah, I'm really worried about white nationalism. I think it's a growing problem. I think very often it's a response to this stuff. I'm not saying that makes it justifiable, not at all, but it is a response. And what I'm interested in is the interplay between the identitarian left and the white nationalist right, because what they share in common is this notion that there is something specific about white people, that there is a white race, that we have a shared outlook, that we all benefit from privilege, which completely ignores the factors of class and economic opportunity. I'm always surprised when when left-wing people adopt the language of white privilege. I'm always really surprised because they've completely erased class, which is the most important factor in people's lives, and the differences between white people are immeasurable. Some white people sell their labour and other white people are billionaires who exploit their labour. The notion that they are all equally privileged, I think, is infantile and actually very anti-left. But I think the white nationalism problem, I think, will get worse in response to the identity politics stuff, precisely because identity politics encourages people to see themselves as a racial category. And if you look at, you mentioned Richard Spencer earlier on, who is a vile ethno-nationalist, but if you look at someone like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, who is celebrated and fawned over by corporations in particular, who are constantly asking for her advice on essentially how to reprimand their white workforce and make sure they have the right views. I think there are some similarities between people like Richard Spencer and people like Robin DiAngelo, which is that both of them want white people to think of themselves as white people. Both of them want white people to conceive of themselves as a racial group that have certain privileges or certain problems. And both of them constantly go on about the need for white people to take themselves to another level. Now, Richard Spencer thinks white people should set up their own little state, whereas Robin DiAngelo thinks white people should self-flagellate for the rest of time for the crimes of their ancestors. But they share in common this obsession with whiteness. And if you think, imagine some young, impressionable white guy who might have hard right views anyway and might spend rather too much time on the internet reading dodgy stuff and watching dodgy videos. If he constantly hears all this stuff about whiteness is terrible, or whiteness is great, or whiteness is the most important force in the whole world because it's oppressing people or it's being oppressed, if he constantly hears about whiteness all the time, at some point he's going to say, okay, that's what I am. I'm a white man, I'm part of the white race, and I'm going to organise as part of the white race. So identitarians are playing with fire. And when you counteract the progressive humanist ideal that what we have in common is more important than what separates us, and also that we ought to judge people as individuals rather than as members of an ethnic or racial or social group, when you undermine that idea, you really create a situation in which identitarianism could spin out of control. And it won't just be the supposedly nice forms of identitarianism like Black Power or the trans movement, which are kind of celebrated forms of identity politics. There'll also be the forms that the liberal elite and the rest of us don't like. White nationalism, for example. I mean, there's a movement in Europe called Generation Identity, which is a largely racist movement. It's a deeply problematic movement. And I would say it's an identity politics movement. So identity politics is deeply destructive, primarily because of the way in which it destroys the humanist ideal of judging people as individuals and replaces it with this constant demand that we rehabilitate racial thinking and approach every aspect of life through a racial lens.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it's just a thought. I mean, you quoted Martin Luther King earlier about judging people by the content of their character. And it's such a beautiful, simple thing to espouse. And it obviously changed the world for many people. And I'm just wondering, it can't be long before a white person quoting MLK gets classed as a racist microaggression. Surely that's next.
That's already happened.
Really? If I missed that one?
Yeah. At the university, one of the universities in California, they distributed a document to staff and others as well in the university about racial microaggressions. And they had a list of things that you shouldn't say to a member of an ethnic minority or to people of colour because it would be experienced as a microaggression. And it had all the usual stuff like, where do you come from, or I like your hair, and all these other things you're not supposed to say apparently to members of certain groups. But it also had a list of things you shouldn't say, which included stuff like, I don't see colour, I just see the individual, or I don't believe in race, I think we need to move beyond race. I mean, these were literally listed as racial microaggressions on the basis that they deny an individual's racial experiences. So it was an explicit turn against the Martin Luther King idea. And I don't think it will be long at all before Martin Luther King is seen as a problematic person because he wanted to escape the idea of race, he wanted to escape the idea of identity, and he wanted to have a world in which character was the most important thing. You know, his approach was incredibly humanist. It was part of the humanist tradition, and it was, as you say, a world-transforming idea, which was it became pretty established through the incredibly hard work of the civil rights movement and its supporters. So I think that's going to happen. Who knows? In 10 years' time, they might be tearing down statues of Martin Luther King because of his failure to accept the importance of identitarianism. So I think that really speaks to how historic this moment is, because even though people like me and others who raise these points, we're called right-wing or far-right or alt-right and all this stuff, which to me makes no sense whatsoever, because actually what I think I'm defending, or at least trying to defend, are really the kind of progressive ideas of the mid-20th century and earlier, which suggested that, we should not view anyone in racial terms. We should not view men and women as being inescapably different, or women as being inferior to men. And we should give everyone as many opportunities as possible, regardless of their national heritage, their racial background, or their or how much money they had growing up. I think that's a pretty good idea through which to organise society. The problem is that the left, sadly, and other sections of the political class have given up on those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, in my leftism, I don't feel like I've changed. I feel like I've stood still for a while on certain principles and seen other people shift further left, if that makes sense. I mean, anyone to the right of these people is far right, it seems. But just circling back around to the influence of BLM on all things UK, and we had a few high-profile stories about black public figures being stopped by the police. So first we had British athlete Bianca Williams, and then we had Labour MP Dawn Butler. And what was quite helpful about both them encounters was we had video to see the particulars and the context. And from what I mean, it's worth stressing at this point, both these stops by the police are being investigated independently, so there may be things we're not aware of yet. But on the face of it, what I could see was professional members of the police force trying to carry out routine stops in a very polite manner and receiving quite a lot of pushback and uncooperative attitudes. And this was spread without question as an instance of racial profiling or institutional racism within the police. And it seems to me now that whenever a black person being stopped by the police makes it into the public eye, it's been treated as default that this is an instance of racism without any further investigation. And I'm just wondering, first of all, how did we get to this point? And secondly, what kind of impact is that going to have on the on policing and their effectiveness going forward, if they can be the next YouTube celebrity simply for doing their job in the context of stopping a black person?
Yeah, I think that's right. I had the same reaction to those recent cases and to other ones as well, where I just thought, all I see in these videos are painfully polite police officers trying to explain to a certain individual why they've been stopped, why they've been asked certain questions. You certainly see no expressions of racism whatsoever. You see no heavy-handedness in those cases that you mentioned. You see simply the police trying to do their job in a particular situation. With the Dawn Butler case, of course, it's legitimate for people to raise questions about why the police seem to have this policy of stopping cars in a certain part of London if they come from outside of London. Is that worth it? Is that a waste of police time? That's a legitimate discussion to have. But the idea that the police stopped Dawn Butler and her friend because they hate black people, because they are fueled by racism, I just think is a complete fantasy. And there was no evidence for it whatsoever in the video clip that we saw. But I think the problem in these situations is that one of the key factors of identity politics is this desire to be a victim. And the desire to be a victim today overrules almost everything else. You get a lot of social credence through being a victim. You get a lot of social capital. In some cases, you might even get a certain amount of state funding. If you can present yourself as part of an oppressed group or an oppressed minority who needs to set up a community group to monitor hate crimes or look for evidence of hateful speech, you could easily get funding for that. This is one of the key ways through which people win social approval or even win a platform in public discussion is by presenting themselves as a victim, by presenting themselves as coming from a victimized community whose voices have been ignored for years and now we need to be heard, etc., etc. So there's a real there's this impact. There's this kind of sense in society right now that it's good to be a victim. And you see it all the time, particularly on campuses. When I speak at universities, I so often meet these really posh young people who've obviously had lovely lives, who will tell me that they suffer from structural oppression. I meet plummy young women who sound like the Queen, who will tell me about the terrible oppression faced by young women like them. And it is so unbelievably unconvincing. I have to kind of nod along to a certain extent to be polite and not come across as a monster. But it is just unconvincing. But it is really about this desire to be a victim. And I thought that the recent case of Jessica Krug, who was the academic at George Washington University, who is a white woman from Kansas, from suburban Kansas, who spent the past few years pretending to be a black woman or a Latino woman or a woman from the Bronx. She kind of chopped and changed her identity over time. Everyone was really shocked by that, but I wasn't particularly shocked, because when you create a culture in which having a victim identity is very often a shortcut to be taken more seriously, and a shortcut to even certain jobs or certain forms of social approval, then it makes sense that people will either invent an identity, as she did, or exaggerate their suffering. So if you look at, there are some Muslim community groups in the UK, for example, who basically trawl the media for proof of Islamophobia. And they pull out all sorts of articles, most of which are not Islamophobic at all. They're just pointing out that, I don't know, a bomber, for example, the Westminster Bridge bomber. Some of the newspapers published a photograph of him at Mecca. And the Muslim Council of Britain complained that publishing a picture of this bomber at Mecca was an attempt to associate Islam with the act that he carried out on Westminster Bridge. I'm sorry, this guy very clearly thought that he was acting in the name of Islam. I'm sure there are millions upon millions of Muslims who think that he wasn't. That's absolutely fine. But he thought he was. Islam was important to him. He went to Mecca. These are important and relevant facts. But what you have are these community groups who reinterpret everything as hate, reinterpret everything as a slight against their community, and they have this desire to present themselves as a victimized minority in order that they can win support or approval or get the social capital of victimhood. And I think those cases that you mentioned, particularly the Dawn Butler one, were good examples of that, where, in my view, Dawn Butler saw an opportunity to present herself as a victim of...
I've never seen her look so happy about being stopped by the police.
She looked really chuffed in that video. That was really striking, because she could present herself as part of that community of victims. The problem with this, more broadly, outside of the Dawn Butler silliness, is that I worry that we're raising a new generation who will come to value suffering more than autonomy, and who will see being pathetic and weak and maybe mentally unstable as things to aspire to, rather than being a solid, autonomous, driven individual. Because when society celebrates weakness and victimhood and suffering and supposed structural oppression, when it celebrates those things or rewards those things, it sends a very clear message to younger people in particular that it's good to be those things, and it's not so good to be a cocksure, head on straight, clear-eyed person who knows what he wants to do and wants to be free to do it. So I think the cult of the victim is a central part of identity politics, and it's probably having a pretty destructive impact on society.
Yeah, and just to pick up on the great point you made about the Muslim Council of Britain, I don't know if you saw recently, but they managed to put pressure on the BBC to edit a headline when they'd mentioned that, Salman Abedi, the bomber of the Manchester Arena in my home city, he'd been seen praying in the foyer beforehand with a backpack the size of the Antarctic, and apparently that detail wasn't worthy of note according to the Muslim Council of Britain. And it really worries me when you have these interest groups that focus on things like that, given all the details about that case, given of all the loss of life and lives changed irreparably, that's the kind of thing they would campaign for to remove from headlines. And it just seems to me that we don't have in regards to jihadism, and maybe that would bring us onto Charlie Hebdo a little bit, we don't seem to have the vocal pushback from the Islamic interest groups within the UK in the right way against these things. And it feels like several years on from Charlie Hebdo, it happened in 2015, and we've seen the recent court cases. The Paris cartoonists republished them cartoons, and we seem to be stuck in the same place with this. It doesn't seem like we've learned anything from this argument, and it doesn't feel like we've learned anything from the case of Salman Rushdie either. And I'm just wondering, what is our problem with pointing to fascism when it has an Islamic face?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Muslim Council of Britain complaint about Salman Abedi and the BBC headline saying that he was seen praying before he carried out his atrocity. I just thought that was really repulsive, what the Muslim Council of Britain did. I mean, I actually thought it was a new low for the Muslim Council of Britain, because what they did on the first day of the Manchester Arena inquiry, the first day, they made it a story of Muslim victimhood rather than a story of the massacre of 22 people, mothers, fathers, children. One victim was 8 years old. This atrocity, which in my mind has been slightly too quickly forgotten, or it certainly doesn't have its place in the public consciousness that I think it should have. On the day that inquiry opened, the Muslim Council of Britain made it about essentially poor Muslims being insulted by the BBC. I mean, how warped does one's moral compass need to be to look at that discussion and look at that event and think about, poor Abedi, or being told, the world being told that he was praying, or someone saw him praying. I thought that was such a terrible example of that kind of Islamic activism. But I think you're right to raise this question about Charlie Hebdo and what we've learned, and well, from Salman Rushdie, as you say. What have we learned? I think we've learned all the wrong things. And, if you remember, after the massacre in 2015, everyone said Je suis Charlie for about 5 minutes, and then it just disappeared. And the way I've always understood that massacre in Paris, which I think was one of the darkest days in modern Europe, higher numbers were killed at the Bataclan, higher numbers were killed at Manchester Arena, higher numbers were killed in Nice, in the truck attack in Nice. That's true, but there was something particularly dark about going into the offices of a magazine and summarily executing people, essentially, for the crime of what they had written or drawn. These people were executed for blasphemy in the 21st century. There's something incredibly perverse and deeply worrying about that. The response to it initially was quite promising. I mean, the largest public gatherings in the history of the French Republic. I went to Paris shortly after that, and you would see everyone was buying Charlie Hebdo. People were reading it in public. There was pro-Charlie Hebdo graffiti all over the place. It would say, everywhere you looked, it would say liberty, equality, Charlie. These were the slogans, and it was very positive, but it didn't last. It didn't last. And not long afterwards, we had the controversy with PEN America. PEN America awarded a bravery award to Charlie Hebdo a few months afterwards, and huge numbers of very influential novelists protested against that award and wrote a public letter saying it shouldn't be given to this magazine because they were insulting to Muslims. The Islamic Human Rights Commission gave its Islamophobe of the Year award to Charlie Hebdo, shortly after its staff had been massacred in their offices, which I just thought was unquestionably, so unbelievably morally perverse.
They made jokes about them not being available to collect the award in person as well, and it was all some sort of big ha-ha, and it was one of the most sickening things I've seen, I think.
It was completely sickening to make those kinds of jokes, to give the award in the first place, and then to make those jokes was just dancing on their graves. It was completely obnoxious. But I think what it demonstrates is that the spirit of Charlie Hebdo is just rejected by so much of the intellectual establishment today. They will not defend freedom of speech in those circumstances. They will not defend the right to blaspheme, supposedly, against Muhammad, and they will not stand shoulder to shoulder with people who say things that they consider too controversial or too insulting to Muslims. The problem with that, if you don't do that, if you don't stand up for the right of Charlie Hebdo to publish these cartoons and to say whatever the hell it wants, then you are given a green light to the return of blasphemy law. And you're given a green light to the idea that anyone who criticizes Islam deserves to be punished in some way. I always saw that. I think the Charlie Hebdo killers were the armed wing of political correctness, because the important thing about them is they grew up in a country, France, where you can be arrested for insulting certain religious faiths. Michel Houellebecq, the controversial novelist, was arrested a couple of decades ago, I think, or a few years ago, for calling Islam the most stupid, ridiculous religion. Brigitte Bardot has been fined. She's now an animal rights activist. She's been fined in France because she has said insulting things about the Islamic preparation of meat. I mean, these two mass murderers didn't emerge in a vacuum. They emerged in a country or on a continent in which the idea that insulting Islam was a bad thing had already been established. And so all they did was push the punishment one step further. According to the woke left, the punishment for being supposedly Islamophobic should be no platforming from campuses or expulsion from polite society or whatever else it might be. And all that these two psychopaths did was take that to the next level, which is that the punishment should actually be higher than that. It should be execution. But that it all exists in the same warped moral universe, a universe in which freedom of speech is pushed down and the idea that everyone has the right not to be offended is pushed up. And that's why I think the Charlie Hebdo thing, I think, should have been one of the biggest wake-up calls of modern times, but sadly it wasn't. And the culture of censorship, and particularly this desire to protect Muslims from any form of offence, that has actually got worse and worse since 2015.
I just wonder if it's maybe useful to start getting the idea of Islamic privilege out there, play them at their own game in that sense. Have you got 5 minutes just to talk about the Oscars before I let you get back to your evening? So you've just penned an article in The Spectator which details this whole push for diversity within liberal Hollywood, really, American movies. There's been some criteria announced that you must meet now to be considered for the Best Picture award at the Oscars. And for me personally, diversity in a film, it isn't an issue. I'll watch anything with a good story, good character, etc. But I think we can all kind of tell when it's being shoehorned or whether it's coming to us with a finger wag. And this is an idea of mandated diversity in that sense, if you want to be considered for the big gongs. And I'm just wondering what kind of, I mean, first of all, what's the idea behind this? What are they hoping to achieve? And what sort of impact is this going to have on art and film in general?
Yeah, I think it's really important to raise that question about the Oscars and what they've just done, because I think it really demonstrates that the problem of political correctness or wokeness, and I think neither of those terms is sufficient to describe the culture we're living through, but that's where we are. I think it really demonstrates that those two things are far more serious than people realise, because what the Oscars have done, when they basically stipulate that movie makers must conform to certain identitarian criteria, they must have a certain number of black or female or LGBTQ characters, or they must have either characters in the film or a certain number of crew members. They're really, it's a form of woke McCarthyism. That's how I described it, because what they're saying is only people who adhere to what we consider to be the correct identitarian worldview, only those people will be considered for Best Picture. And by implication, if anyone fails to do what they think you should do, if you don't have black stories or trans stories or a certain number of ethnic minorities on your crew, then they will punish you by excluding you from the Best Picture category. That is a form of McCarthyism. You know, in the 1950s, you could be blacklisted from Hollywood for having communist views, which I think was outrageous. No one should be blacklisted for their political views. And now you can be blacklisted from the Best Picture award for failing to adhere to what the politically correct overlords at the Academy consider to be the right identitarian outlook. I think it's a grotesque imposition into artistic freedom. It is an attempt to subject art to external criteria, and that is never a good idea. Imagine telling... Well, Kirstie Alley said it. Kirstie Alley got into a lot of trouble by criticising the Academy and saying, imagine telling Picasso what he could put into his effing paintings, as she said on Twitter.
I think she deleted that tweet, I think the mob came for her and she kind of thought it's not worth all the heat. And that goes to show exactly what you can expect if you challenge the orthodoxy in this area.
Exactly. So not only does the Oscars do something as stupid and illiberal and divisive as this, but also anyone who kicks up a stink or raises a criticism risks being pursued by the mob as well. It's really, really worrying because for two reasons. Firstly, I think it basically says to movie makers, you have to adhere to these political standards if you ever want to win the Best Picture award. So that's a political imposition into the artistic process, which is completely unacceptable. Also, it will give rise to tokenism, right? Because if you now have a filmmaker who thinks he's making a really good film, thinks he's got a chance to get the most prestigious award in the film world, he may well now say to himself, I'm going to make a character transgender just to please the Academy. That's not good for transgender people, and it's not good for the movie maker himself, who's obviously doing things out of external pressure rather than the logic of the story, the logic of the artistic process, the logic of his own desires to tell whatever story he wants to. Decades ago, Hollywood had very strict rules on what you could depict in terms of sexual relationships. So, kisses could last for a certain amount of time. People had to be shown sleeping in separate beds. They had these weird, strict rules many decades ago about how you should depict sex. Now, in the supposedly enlightened 21st century, they're introducing these strict rules on how you should depict minority groups and women and gay people. That is not a step forward. That's a step backward. And I think what it demonstrates is that the new tyranny of wokeness is now a palpable threat to artistic liberty and to freedom of thought and to the right of people to understand the world in the way that they want to and to depict the world in the way that they want to. And everything could suffer as a consequence of this. Literature, comedy, film, public discussion. And I think that's why it's important all the time to push back against this notion that other people have the right to tell us how to think.
No, that's a great point. I recommend people check out your Spectator column on that. So just one last thing before I let you go. I don't think I've ever seen you on Twitter. You're definitely not on Twitter anymore. You used to be on Facebook, but I don't think you are anymore. So what's that about? Do you just think you're better than the rest of us who are having to suffer through social media? Is this a conscious effort? Have you been memory hold?
No, I can't abide social media. I know I should. I know people tell me it has huge benefits.
They're lying.
I suspect you could be right. I've never used Twitter. I will never go on Twitter. It's not my kind of world. I did use Facebook for a while, but I kind of had a love-hate relationship with it, and I've stopped using it. I do, however, use Instagram. Instagram, I think, is the nicest social media platform because it's just photos of things and you don't have the same kind of toxic, insulting debate that you get on other social media platforms. So I'm only on Instagram. Everything else I avoid like the plague.
Excellent. Well, Brendan, I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I think I could have gone on for a few more hours about this topic, especially on identity politics and freedom of expression. Is there anything else you'd like to point people towards before I let you get back to what's left of your evening?
They should read Spiked. You can follow Spiked on Twitter. They should definitely do that. And they should listen to Spike's podcast and, of course, your podcast.
Wonderful. Thanks for speaking to me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Stephen.